Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal Haynes. Tonight on Greater Boston, former Massachusetts Congressman Joe Kennedy and NAACP President Derrick Johnson join me on their new partnership in bringing training and funding to emerging civil rights and community activists. Then later, Jared Bowen sits down with astronaut Scott Kelly on his time at the International Space Station, his hopes for the future of space travel, and what he learned up there about life down here. Well, there's no shortage of people in this country who are fed up with the status quo and want to make a stand against generations of systematic racism, climate injustice, LGBTQ discrimination, and more. But without the right resources and connections, even the most passionate voices can go unheard. And that's the idea behind a new partnership between the NAACP and the Groundwork Project, a political organization founded by former Congressman Joe Kennedy. The two groups are launching the Organizing Accelerator. It's a 20-week mentoring, training, and networking fellowship program for up-and-coming grassroots and community organizers, campaigners, social justice advocates, and civil rights leaders. Well, here with me in the studio today is Joe Kennedy and President and CEO of the NAACP, Derrick Johnson. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
So talk to me about this new project. This is a little bit of a different political avenue for you.
It is. It's a little bit different, but I think an opportunity to continue a lot of the work that I and other members of my family have done for a long time, and thrilled and honored to be able to do this with President Johnson and the NAACP. And this really came about from a conversation that we had together as the organization I started, Groundwork Project, was getting up and running in Mississippi in one of our first phone calls, where President Johnson said that there's an enormous amount of talent in places that often is overlooked by the regular traditional political infrastructure. You can't say there isn't talent throughout the South, or throughout the Plains, particularly in the South was the birthplace and the driving force behind the civil rights movement. It's here. The system just doesn't see it, doesn't nurture it, doesn't hone it, doesn't take advantage of it, and doesn't mentor it. And so we asked if we could work together to try to find a way to do that, and thrilled that a year or so later, we're giving it a shot.
Yeah, so talk to me about the NAACP's role in all of this and why, you had that conversation with Mr. Kennedy.
Well, no, I reside in Jackson, Mississippi, and many of the veterans of the civil rights movement were mentors of mine. I grew up in Detroit, but I went to Tougaloo College. And they exposed to me what was possible. I had no concept around civil rights, social justice, and that I actually could build a career out of helping people. And so in that process, we have an existing program in Mississippi, myself and Chairman Thompson, who was the chair of the Homeland Security Commission, we created. It's now in the 11th year. And the goal there is, how do we give young people exposure of what's possible, how they can add their talents and their time to help the very communities they come from. And so when Joe and I started talking, I said, what if we did this nationally? How can we expose individuals to opportunities that they, in many cases, don't even know that's possible? And that's where we landed here. In order for us to make democracy work for all, individuals must understand their agency, how their talents can be applied, and the true nature of how things happen. It happened from lived experience, connected with exposure, connected to networks, and people understanding the opportunity.
So we know that the Groundwork Project is in Alabama, Mississippi, West Virginia, Oklahoma, and of course Massachusetts. Are those states intentional? I think we understand the Massachusetts connection, right? But the other places, is that intentional to be in those places first?
Absolutely. So look, I spent nearly a decade in Congress and campaigned for candidates at almost every level of office all across the country. The amount of times, though, that I was asked to go campaign for a candidate at any level, in the Deep South, in the Plains, or in Appalachia, it was very infrequent. I was one of the only members of Congress to go campaign for somebody in West Virginia, where far too many of us just wrote it off, said, you can't win there, right? And what you do when you realize that is, by writing communities off, writing people off, even if you're trying to say, hey, we have to prioritize effort and talent and resources, what you're really saying is, we can't reach you. Your voices, we say they count, but they don't count as much if you actually are intentional about making sure that they're heard. And you can't, democracy is not just a given. You have to work at it. You have to exercise it. You have to invest in it. And when we write off parts of the country, wide swaths and sections of the country, that has huge implications for the health of our democracy. It means when you have to run for the presidency, there's swaths of the country that you actually don't have the infrastructure set up to be competitive in. It means that we can have unified control, Democratic Party can have unified control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and still lose Roe versus Wade off of a Supreme Court case coming out of Mississippi, can still see voting rights threatened out of Alabama, can still see our ability to regulate climate change threatened out of now well-known major question doctrine out of where? West Virginia. These places we often don't think of as battleground states. They are at the pointy end of the spear for a battleground on some of the biggest, most consequential fights in our country, and yet still are far too often neglected by forces there that are supposed to be defending and protecting all of us.
President Johnson, what do you see as the barriers to access? These folks who are grassroots organizers, who are there trying to get people together. You mentioned this a little bit before, but what are the barriers here to the connection to the traditional, I guess, political machine, if you will, for these folks to get involved, to get on the ballot, to get their voices heard, to be the driving force of legislation?
If you think about our political landscape, we have dwindled the conversation to two political parties who actually quarantine their efforts in regions of the state. And so for African Americans, if you live in the Deep South, you're quarantined with the political party who don't care about your interests, who work against your survival, and in many ways seek to diminish your voice. And so our goal is, how do we expand the landscape so people can be heard and their voices can be felt through public policy? The fact that Mississippi created public policy that ended up in the Supreme Court, which has now overturned Roe v. Wade, is a direct example of a whole swath of a community whose voice have been left out. Just in 2015, there was an effort to adopt in the state personhood, and it was because African Americans defeated that ballot referendum that we stopped it, but yet the public policy, because the majority party in that state was able to maneuver it and get it in front of a Supreme Court. We must, as a nation, get out of tribalism, recognize that public policy is paramount to people's voice, and that political parties are vehicles for public policies. And as long as we have parties in the South that won't recognize African Americans, in West Virginia won't recognize poor people, we're going to have a lopsided reality that sometime one party wins, the next time another party wins, but whole communities are being left out all the time.
Yeah, one of the data points on the website for Groundwork is in 2018, people of color made up 20% of eligible voters, but only cast around 10% of all the ballots. And that power gap was nearly 50%. Is the best approach then to address that? So, you know, the fact that we're empowering these civil rights leaders, these activists, these grassroots organizers.
It's a critical step to doing so. And we've talked about parts of the Deep South. We mentioned Appalachia and the Plains. Democracy is earned, and democracy has to be exercised, and that's the true no matter where, including in Massachusetts. And we see some of those similar inequities even in this state. As progressive and as proud as some of us might be of that, you still see voter turnout differences within Greater Boston and other parts of the state. You still see a concentration of resources in Greater Boston versus other parts of the state. The South Coast, Springfield, Worcester, Pioneer Valley, and other places. This has to be something that we all are committed to, and that only happens when you have people going out there, knocking on the door, checking in on a neighbor, asking them what they're confronted with, what are issues that they struggling with in their community, and how can we help? And that can be done, needs to be done, across the community, across our country, year-round. It's, from my perspective, a basic responsibility of citizenship, and this is what we're trying to get back to.
And this,
what's key with the voter turnout, the example you look at, in this nation, if 60% of the total voting age population vote, we say it's a high turnout. That should be an embarrassment. When in Canada, you're talking about 92% of voters participate. In Germany, about 93%. In Australia, with cumulative voting, you're talking about 96%. We have to open up access to the voting box so we can have a true representative democracy. One of the areas of the parts of the country that seek to shut down access to voting is the southern landscape, the former Confederate states, out of the fear of African American and now the emerging Latino community, actively participating, and they are citizens. If we do that, we open up opportunity across the country with access around governance and ensuring that governance is inclusive of all communities. That's what this really is about. How do you get those individuals in targeted states, similar to what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia, opening up democracy so all the voices can be heard?
And we know this fellowship program, this latest cohort here, is working to do just that. So talk a little bit about, one, I want to know the process in selecting these folks, because we know access is an issue, right? And not everyone knows somebody who knows that this is available as a resource. So talk to me about that, and then what we hope to get from this cohort of fellowship.
So we put an application process out. It was actually a tight timeline given the opportunities that we have to try to bring them to our partners here at Harvard, and then in Washington with the Biden Institute, and then down in Jackson at Tougaloo College. But in just a couple of weeks, we had over 110 applicants. We selected 16. They're from, the application pool came in from 26 states, age range from 18 to over 60 years old. The applicants we selected are predominantly between the ages of 20 and 40. They're from 11 states, from West Virginia and Alabama and Mississippi and Nebraska and New York, Oklahoma, across the spectrum. And what we hope to do is, one, allow these extraordinary leaders the opportunity to recognize their own talent, be in community with others and enable them to lift each other up. Provide them opportunities to learn from some of the most extraordinary academics and practitioners in the country at some of these places. Build camaraderie within them, community within them, and then the opportunity to lift each other up over the years ahead, to be able to go back to their communities over time and start to build the political ecosystem that we are able to see in places like a Boston or a Cambridge or New York and other spots around the country.
Much has been made about the changing political landscape, quotation marks around that. Is work like the Groundwork Project, is the work like the NAACP is doing, and I am going to ask you about the convention coming into town this year, is that part of this change? And do we believe that the next election cycle is going to be much different than the last two?
This is part of this change, but this is also, it shouldn't have to be, right? This is a reality. The fact that people going out there fighting for their right to vote, fighting their right to be seen and heard, and part of a community, recognized as part of a community and organized, and allowing those organizers, folks in these communities that have the credibility and have earned the respect to be able to hone that talent. This goes back to literally the founding aspects of democracy. And so while unfortunately some aspects of this is new, and what we're trying to invest in and expand is new, it shouldn't be. And the tragedy, as the president points to, is we see the real ramifications of this lag and the democracy deficit we see, even in parts of our country, and the work that we have to do to build a democracy that is wholly inclusive and fair and representative of all of us.
We're in an inflection point in this country, right? But we are on the right side of history, and we're going to continue to progress. If you think about Memphis and the police brutality that just took place, the accountability was only because we worked really hard in Memphis to increase voter participation in August for their district attorney's race, to remove a district attorney who had been there 8 years, who refused to accept DNA evidence. She was horrible, but with the new DNA, within a week, those officers were suspended and then fired and brought on charges. That is what representative governance looked like, when people can participate and ensure that the system is accountable. But more importantly, if we continue to go in the way of the past administration, we're going to devolve into tribalism. None of us can afford that. But because we are progressing in the right direction as a result of a good voter turnout in 2020 and then in 2022, we're seeing progress being made. When we get to 2024, it is our hope and our goal to empower more people to add their voices, their talents, their skills, so we can continue to progress away from tribalism and true representative democracy.
Well, speaking of that, Boston has a certain reputation, and we had the announcement that the NAACP will be holding their convention there. And as Tanisha Sullivan, the president of the Boston chapter, said, it is intentional and it is not a mistake that it is here. Talk to me about the work that we hope to get accomplished in Boston a little bit.
First of all, Tanisha Sullivan is one of the most skilled and talented leaders in the association. Boston is important, but Boston is America. Boston is no different than America. I grew up in the city of Detroit, the most segregated metro area in the country during the time I was growing up. I live in Jackson, Mississippi, enough said. So Boston have a unique history like the rest of America. But it's an opportunity for this community to embrace not only the African American community, but the NAACP. Our goal is not just to be in a convention center, but get into the communities to show that the diversity of our communities, plural, is the strength of our nation. And we want to help demonstrate that here in the city. We had decided to come here in 2020, but the pandemic hit, and the world went upside down.
Yes,
so now we're here, and we hope to come from all across the country, participate in the richness of the Boston community, as we also bring real substantive conversation around equity, inclusion, and opportunity.
And through this program, you know, it runs through, you know, this weekend with the cohort, and you're in town to connect with them. There's going to be lots of exciting things happening.
There's a lot of exciting things happening. So we've got a forum tonight over at the Kennedy School at Harvard. We've got a bunch of programming tomorrow, Saturday. We'll take them on tours of some of the great sites and institutions and history here in Boston as well. And an awful lot of learning and working and collaborating. And one of the things I'm looking forward to as well is the back and forth that this cohort actually is able to provide to the students of Harvard University, right? Undergraduate, graduate as well, in this back and forth and the learning that can take place on both sides and the opportunities that will come from that, right? For folks that haven't ever been here before, just to watch talent interact in a kinetic environment and see the good that will come from it. So
Absolutely.
exciting time.
Yeah, absolutely. Joe Kennedy, Derrick Johnson, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
For more information, head to the organizingaccelerator.org. Up next, back in 2016, astronaut Scott Kelly landed on Earth after a history-making year-long mission in space. Since then, he's been traveling the world, visiting the places he saw from aboard the International Space Station and sharing the lessons he learned up there about life down here on Earth. Among his latest stops, the GBH studio at the Boston Public Library, where he sat down with Jared Bowen for a wide-ranging conversation about it all.
Scott Kelly, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
So you broke the record for time spent in space, a full year there. How do you encapsulate what it is like to be living in space for an entire year?
It's challenging. It's hard. Certainly exciting. There's a lot of stuff that's fun, but a lot of hardship goes with it. Being away from your friends, your family, being away from Earth, particularly the weather, be able to go outside. So, but at the same time, it's the most rewarding thing I think I've ever done in my life.
What does it feel like? Because I realize we can't understand, we're not in it, but when we're watching it, it looks like this graceful liftoff, and we see these calm, serene pictures of you all inside.
Yeah, when the shuttle lifts off, it looks like it's lifting off slowly, but when you're inside, there's nothing slow about it. You get the feeling you're going somewhere. You're really not sure where you're going, but you're not coming back to Florida. And it's a wild ride. 7 million pounds of thrust instantly when those solid rocket motors light.
What are your hopes for where we can go next?
Well, I'm really excited about the Artemis program, and probably within the next 3 years, we're going to send a crew of 4 people around the moon. First time we've done that since the early 70s. That's very exciting, with the goal of 5 to maybe, I don't know how many years later, landing people on the moon. And having a lunar space station in lunar orbit, maybe potentially a lunar base at some times. But ultimately, our goal would be to go to Mars. There's a lot we can learn from going to Mars. And I think, in the immediate future, the next, 50, 100 years, I think that's the big goal, is to put human boots on Mars. So hopefully I'll get to see that someday.
We'll start with the closest goal first, moon landing. Why is it so significant to go back there? It has been, more than 50 years at this point?
Yeah. We can learn a lot for our future mission to Mars. The moon is only a couple of days away versus 200 days away. If you have a problem, you can get home quickly, whereas if you're on Mars, you can't. Take a really long time. The moon is 1/6 the size of Earth, so 1/6 the amount of gravity as compared to Mars, which is 1/3. So less gravity, makes certain things easier for your design of your rocket and your operations and what you're going to learn from that. There's no atmosphere on the moon. That has some advantages. Mars has a little bit of an atmosphere, so it almost seems like it was put there for us to practice with. But also, China has plans to land people on the moon, and in 2029, I think their goal is. So we used this, geopolitical competition during the 60s and 70s to get to the moon. I think there's still an argument to doing, for the same reasons, to go back before the Chinese.
Well, speaking of geopolitical competition, you are on board the International Space Station with the Russians. They were your colleagues up there. What's that relationship like now?
It's somewhat, with some of my Russian friends, it's changed, but not in a bad way necessarily, because some Russians that I know feel very similar about the war in Ukraine as I do and many Americans do, that this is it's wrong. They're committing war crimes. It's a threat to freedom and democracy around the world. So a lot of them that I know feel that way, with one exception, and there are actually maybe two exceptions. They're ashamed and they're embarrassed, right, by the whole thing, that their country is doing this. Now there are others that feel like a lot of these ultra-nationalist Russians do, where they feel like they're just defending themselves from how they describe, the Nazis and NATO. It's nonsense. And some of these folks that I know are, they seemed at the time to be smart people. They seemed to be good people, good friends, but somehow they've just been completely brainwashed, and it's really sad to see. Hopefully, my hopes are that someday they'll come back around to reality.
You've gotten to know President Zelensky. What do you see unfolding there, and what about his leadership gives you a sense of how this is going to play out?
Yeah, so in the beginning of this war, I was a real advocate for the Ukrainian people. I have some Ukrainian American family members and friends, but I'm also a big believer in freedom and democracy, and I think it's the most important thing that we have. And I feel like the war in Ukraine is not only a threat to Ukrainian sovereignty, but also a threat to just the idea of liberty and democracy, freedom around the world. So I had a big platform, social media platform, as a result of spending a lot of time in space, and a lot of my followers are also in Russia. I wrote a book that was published in Russian, so I felt like maybe I could make a difference trying to give the Russians some real information. So early on in the war, I tried to do that, oftentimes in Russian. Got kind of sideways with the head of the Russian space program after he threatened to leave an American guy in space, and he also threatened like nuclear war and stuff too. But so that was, and I raised a bunch of money on my own initiative, and that was noticed by the Ukrainians. So they asked me to come on board and help with a fundraiser to raise money for ambulances.
Going back to your time there for a minute, I wonder, do you ever get so used to being there that you stop thinking about the fact that you're living in space?
No, you never really feel completely normal or forget. Even despite the beauty of the Earth and how incredible it is, when you're looking at it for a year from the space station, you get pretty familiar with it. Remember one time I opened a window shade, and very quickly I noticed this sand, on Earth, this patch of sand, that just from the texture and the color, I knew it was this little patch of desert north of Mogadishu in Somalia within seconds. And I thought to myself, maybe it's time to come home.
Did your notion of what Earth is and what is happening here, did it ever change when you have that much distance and you're looking down at it?
Yes, so, often astronauts talk about this thing called the overview effect, orbital perspective. I think I've heard those terms, that basically when you're able to look at the Earth from space, you understand just how fragile the environment is. I mean, our atmosphere looks like a film over the surface, almost like a contact lens over somebody's eye is how fragile it looks. You see parts of the planet that are almost always covered in pollution. Asia, areas in Central America. You know that the United States is one of the biggest polluters in the world, but it's the type of pollution you can't see. It's not a particulate where it would obscure the ground. So you know that pollution is a big problem. You see the rainforests in South America, I noticed over the course of my time in space. You know, every time I flew, it seemed to get worse and worse. You know, more cleared fields, more burning fields, but you also see the planet with no political borders, like we're used to seeing on a map. So it makes you think, hey, we're all in this thing called humanity together. We got challenges around the world with whether it's climate or otherwise, and you know, what happens on one side of the planet can affect the rest of the planet very, very quickly, as we saw during the pandemic. So it gives, I think, a good shift to your perspective on the environment, but also on humanity.
You've had this really interesting pursuit in being back on Earth, that you're visiting places that really captivated you from in space. What have you discovered? Where have you gone to visit them up close and personal?
You know, there are some places that are really catch your eye from space. The Bahamas are it's such an expansive area of blue that it just really is incredibly beautiful. So I'd been to the Bahamas before, but I went a couple times after I've been back. There's also these little tiny colorful lakes north of the Himalayas. In Tibet. I've been there since I've been back. Yeah, we've traveled in the last 6 to 7 years, a lot of places that I wanted to go as a result from looking at it in space. The spot between the North and South Islands of New Zealand, that strait, been there. I mean, I've been a lot of places since I've been back, places that I decided when I was in space I wanted to go visit.
And finally, is you're wearing the NASA pin the signal to NASA that you'll go back at a moment's notice?
I'd go back in space, yeah, if I could. Not forever. I wouldn't do the one-way mission to Mars. Not interested.
Scott Kelly, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, everybody, that's it for tonight. But come back tomorrow for Talking Politics. The effects of climate change are coming for the state's coastlines, and mitigation and adaptation efforts will be complicated and costly. Who's going to pay for it? Adam Riley and his panel will dig into that. Plus, do Governor Haley's new tax and budget proposals live up to the promises she made on the campaign trail? That and more tomorrow at 7. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Crystal Haynes. Good night.